The First Mass of Christmas, taken from the Kindle edition of the Collyhurst Kid, or A Brat's Tales. Midnight Mass was over, and I was to serve the first Mass of Christmas over at the convent. All of us altar boys looked forward to serving Mass at the convent, because the nuns always fussed you so much. I suppose it was the mothering instinct in them. Small altar boys, I'm sure, were seen as little priests. Anyway, the midnight Mass was over, and I'd just finished putting away the priest's vestments when Sister Agnes came in to walk me over to the convent. It was one of those crystal clear nights, where every star stood out against the deep velvet blue of the Christmas midnight sky. I looked up, my head fully back, mouth ajar, and gaped at the wonder of it all. Sister Agnes nudged me in the direction of the Convent of Good Hope. Father Branham was to say Mass, and that was a terrific relief to me, because the Canon Early, was feared by all and sundry. He had once been known to interrupt the proceedings of the Sunday Mass, pick up the huge Tridentine Bible, walk down the few steps to the altar boy serving, and to bring the book down hard upon the boy's unsuspecting head. All because 6:30 in the morning was a poor time for a boy to be fully awake. This particular action of the Canon had made a bad impression on me, and I lived in mortal fear of falling asleep, one day to be sent to everlasting damnation by a violent blow to the skull with the Holy Bible. Anyway, the Canon, thank God, had said the midnight Mass, and it was Father Brannan's duty to say Mass at the convent. As we entered the silent halls of the mother house, the loud aroma of eggs and bacon attacked my 10-year-old nostrils. It was so quiet and peaceful in this female enclave that it always made me feel holy, almost as though God was somehow tangible in this place. I always felt that I had to whisper and creep about from place to place, avoiding any noise that might disturb the sanctity. Sister Agnes led me through to the small chapel, and I prepared myself for the Mass. Few experiences in life have ever approached the spiritual excitement of that long-ago night. The angelic singing of the nuns, the deeply rich brogue of Father Brannan entoning the Latin liturgy, and the buzzing intentness a boy feels when he's wide awake and 5 or 6 hours past his bedtime, helped to make it one of the most memorable experiences of my life. Eventually, the Mass ended. The convent Mass was invariably shorter than the lay Mass because the nuns were always busy and needed to be off about their good deeds, I supposed. I cleared away the altar with the help of a nun who must have been approaching her second centenary. She whisked about, quietly efficient. I'm sure that she wasn't breathing because she gave no sign of life other than that she was moving about. As a deeply religious young man, I knew that the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and if there were such things as miracles, then a convent was the most appropriate place for one. The old nun finished her duties and retired to whatever cupboard they kept her in until the next Mass. Sister Agnes floated into the room where I was removing my cotter and cassock. This was another miracle to me. The nuns always appeared to float from one place to another. If they had legs, I never saw them, and I didn't know anyone who had. Oh, my clever older sister insisted that they had legs like anyone else, but still, seeing was believing, as Thomas said, and I'd never seen them, nor had she. In the softest voice I've ever heard, she invited me to follow her. I didn't dare say anything for fear of the walls falling down. Only people who had trained for years could speak so delicately. I crept behind her, careful to make no noise in this most silent of homes. From somewhere deep inside the house I heard the quiet response of other nuns at prayer. It was a most gentle and reassuring sound. It made me feel warm and pleasant inside. Sister Agnes eventually led me into the kitchen, which was white, scrubbed and pristine. She left me in the hands of Sister Paula, a young, giggly Irish girl who fed me a man-sized plate of eggs, bacon, sausage, tomatoes and toast. A pint mug of tea completed this king's feast. It was the perfect end to a perfectly delightful night. Sister Paula giggled as she asked if I'd had enough. "Your thanks," I said, through a mouthful of toast, egg and tea. She fussed around and made me feel important. This was the way I always felt when I'd served Mass at the convent. It was as though I was every bit as precious as the canon. Now there's a wicked thought that stayed with me through the years. All good things come to an end, and it was soon time for me to take my leave of the pleasant, whispering, humble nuns. I had a good mile to walk home, and some of it past the bombed-out houses on Livesey Street. We called the houses bombed out because they were the derelict slums ready for demolition. They'd started clearing the area years before. I suppose the expression bombed out was a hangover from the war, but it had an appeal and an attraction to us kids that kept the expression alive. I left the confines of the convent and headed off home. I don't think I'd ever been out this late alone before. I was a little frightened, but the night was beautiful, and the Hindleys and Bradys of this world were still some time away. I set out in the direction of home, keeping myself in the exact centre of the pavement, my eyes straining to maintain the widest peripheral vision possible. Nothing was going to take me by surprise. Of course, I did not at that time realise that I was attempting to use peripheral vision. As far as I was concerned, I was just keeping my eyes peeled, as any young boy or cavalry scout would. Weird and wonderful thoughts flowed through my mind. I'd always been a fanciful youth, as my mother called me. Tigers stalked me on that bright Christmas night long ago. Natives of the Amazon with poisonous blowpipes were lurking if the tigers failed, and Nazis with lethal Lugers were lying in wait around every corner. Well, the night was too wonderful to sustain these romantic notions for long. The vastness of the heavens overwhelmed me and raised my spirits. Fresh from not one but two Christmas masses, my mind swirled with images of that night 2,000 years ago. I searched the sky for the star that guided, the one I'd heard so much about. They were all so bright and promising that I'd chosen 4 or 5 definites before I had walked to the arches that marked the midpoint of Livesey Street. The railway arches loomed up and dispelled my thoughts of the guiding star. The new sodium lights picked out the rust spots on the side of the bridge, which in my mind were obviously the remnants of some wartime strapping raid of the Jerrys. Beneath the bridge it was dark and menacing. I consciously moved a little further over to the far side of the pavement from the inner arch walls. I shifted the small suitcase which carried my altar clothes in front of my body, so that should anyone jump out to get me, I'd be able to shove the case at them and make a fast escape. No one jumped out to get me, and I passed under the bridge safely. I breathed a sigh of relief on reaching the far side and continued on my way. I was still about 2/3 of a mile from home, and now I had to pass the derelict houses on the Oldham Road end of Livesey Street. These held little fear for me in the daytime, because it was in them, with pals, that I spent so much of my playing out time. They were castles, forts, headquarters, saloons, caves, dens, and empties to be wrecked before the wreckers moved in. It was in these empty houses that Johnny, Carl, Paul, Tony, and I were kings. Knights, Jerrys, Desert Rats, Hopalong Cassidy, Johnny Ringo, Geronimo, and a host of others. We spent all of our wild days roaming and scavenging among the debris of those who had left the area before us. I walked on. As I passed from under the shadow of the arches, my mind wandered once more, this time lingering on the presents I hoped to receive later that morning. Would I get the Winchester repeating rifle I so desperately needed? Would I get a good book like last year's? I'd received the Coral Island the previous Christmas, and much of the subsequent year was spent reenacting the adventures of Ralph, Jack, and Peterkin. As I approached the first of the row of derelict houses, I felt myself physically tensing, for whilst I knew they were empty and always found them exciting during the day, at night they held a certain menace and threat which chilled me. The empty sockets of the windows seemed to follow my movements, and the gaping mouths of the doors looked as if they waited to swallow me up. I steeled myself and walked on, once more adjusting my grip on the small suitcase I carried. I knew these houses well. I'd been born on the next street, Railway Street. It was on these 2 streets that Bernard Wrigley taught me to ride a 2-wheel bicycle without the aid of stabilisers. These were the streets of my early childhood, and I took some comfort from that knowledge. All of my accumulated memories associated with them were warm and loving and good. I walked on, my eyes strained to the left, searching the gaping holes that once were the windows of these dead homes. I searched for whatever lurked in the darkness within. Nothing happened. I had passed the first half dozen or so of the terrace when it did happen. There was a loud bang, followed by a gruffly uttered oath. I swear to God I felt the hair on my scalp prickle, as though readying itself to stand on end. I may have let out an involuntary yelp of fear. I know that I thought the noises were somehow a threat to me, and terror had welled up in my throat, ready to be released in a scream. It was then that I took to my heels, and I didn't stop until I reached the comparative safety and the lights of Oldham Road. During that fevered run, my ever-fertile imagination had been active. I'd obviously heard a murderer. There had been a murder the year before in Queen's Park. It was a kidnapper. I'd read plenty about them. It was some monster from beyond the earth. I'd seen the Quatermass experiment on television. Or else it was something worse, something even my fevered imagination couldn't cope with. I stopped running at the edge of Oldham Road and allowed my breath to catch me up. My rational mind began to assert itself, and I eventually came to the conclusion that there was only one plausible explanation for what I had heard. I had heard a tramp. One of those gentlemen of the road turning over in the night and cursing his ill luck at knocking something over. It was as simple and as frightening as that. Tramps were quite commonplace at that time, and it was well known that they used the empty shells of the houses for the roof and the occasional shelter they provided. The house I had passed was nothing more unusual or dangerous than a kip for one of these unfortunates. I took some solace from this realisation. The tramps were as happy in the old houses as we children were, and they were probably more welcome and less malevolent guests. It's strange, but as I stood preparing to cross the road, I began to feel that this experience somehow added new meaning to the Christmas story for me. In particular, it seemed to give some form of substance to this particular Christmas night. If anything I had been taught about Jesus was true, wasn't it true that he'd been born to be the saviour of the poorest of the poor? Didn't he come into the world in accommodation not too far removed from the accommodation of the tramp that I'd just heard? Wasn't it on just such a night with a million stars up above that he chose to come to earth? The more I pondered these thoughts, the more relevance I took from the experience, the more significant this chance encounter seemed to me. It certainly made me think about the way so many others would be spending that Christmas night. I felt that the tramp was somehow closer to the true meaning and spirit of the season than I could ever be. I continued on my journey home to the warm house with the surprise presents, waiting patiently for the liberation the dawn would bring. I still get goose pimples when I recall that bump in the night and the curse that accompanied it. Without them, I don't think that this long ago Christmas would still feel like it happened only yesterday.